All right. Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome. We're just starting to have people trickle in, but I wanted to get us started. My name is Sammy Steepen, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California. I'm joined today by my colleagues in the Accessibility and Accommodations Committee, Doctors Julia Hike and Ariel Edward Height. And together we will be presenting this workshop on making presentations great and accessible. According to the CDC, over 61 million US adults, which is about 1 in 4, report having at least one disability. This infographic from the CDC highlights the percent of people with a disability across 6 categories: hearing, vision, cognition, mobility, self-care, and independent living. Additionally, in 2019, the National Science Foundation reported that for those of working age, 10.5% of the US population had a disability. Although disabilities are prevalent, persons with disabilities are underrepresented in the US workforce. In the left panel, you'll see the labor force participation rate from 2023 for individuals 64 and younger provided by the Department of Labor. For individuals with disabilities, the labor participation rate lags significantly behind that of their non-disabled peers by nearly half. Additionally, among those who want to work, individuals with disabilities are unemployed at twice the rate of their non-disabled counterparts, and that's shown in the right panel. And this underrepresentation extends to STEM fields. The National Science Foundation provides statistical information about the participation of women, minorities, and persons with disabilities in science and engineering. Here, we are presenting the characteristics of the STEM workforce for individuals 74 and younger, showing that 3% of the STEM workforce reports having one disability. Notably, this proportion has remained unchanged from 2011 to 2021. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was a groundbreaking piece of legislation and the first major federal effort prohibiting discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Specifically, it applied to workplaces, schools, and medical settings that receive federal funding. This was a monumental step forward, ensuring that people with disabilities would no longer face exclusion or unequal treatment in these essential parts of daily life. Beyond simply prohibiting discrimination, the law also created oversight mechanisms, which were critical for enforcing these protections. One of the most forward-thinking aspects of the Rehab Act was its inclusion of accessibility standards for technology, anticipating the importance of making technology accessible to all. This law continues to be amended to meet the evolving needs of individuals with disabilities. Its ongoing updates reflect our growing commitment to ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to participate fully in society. The Rehabilitation Act served as a model for a later landmark legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 1990, this landmark US law extended civil rights protections to individuals with disabilities by ensuring that they would no longer face discrimination or exclusion in critical areas of public life. Key provisions of the ADA prohibited discrimination in employment, transportation, public accommodations, and telecommunications. We in the Accessibility and Accommodations Committee are dedicated to furthering ARO's commitment to diversity, equality, and inclusion by supporting and expanding access for all members. We evaluate mechanisms to improve access to all aspects of ARO programming, making sure that every member can engage regardless of their individual circumstances. We explore cutting-edge assistive technology to ensure that everyone has the tools and the resources they need to participate. We explore options to provide access to ARO activities for members with caregiving responsibilities, ensuring that they're able to participate without compromising their important roles. And finally, we're dedicated to communicating best practices, like today, for example, with this presentation. Looking to the future, other upcoming efforts for communicating best practices by our committee include online templates and resources, which are available to help create accessible posters, presentations, and transcripts. You can find these resources on our website shown here. These tools are designed to make it easier for everyone to participate and engage in ARO activities. Additionally, as a part of our student poster blitz, posters at the midwinter meeting are now separately judged for accessibility. The criteria for the judging have been shared with students, and our hopes is that this initiative helps to spark important conversations at the conference about accessibility. We are also excited to announce that we will have a dedicated poster in the poster hall this coming month, focused on conference-specific accessibility, offering insights and further information on how we're working to create an inclusive environment. Looking ahead, we're committed to expanding the accessibility of our year-round resources, just to be able to ensure that our efforts extend beyond the conference itself to better serve our members. And like I mentioned before, current resources that we have, such as templates and design best practices, are readily available on the ARO website. And this is for posters and oral presentations. Additionally, our website has recordings of past coffee hour presentations, and it will also, in the near future, have this presentation as well. I would like to take this time now to introduce Ariel, who will take over from here. Oh, we can't hear you, Ariel.
All right, thanks, Sammy. Ariel here. I want to start off with some proper acknowledgements. A significant number of slides and content from today's presentation come from previous workshops presented alongside three colleagues of mine, all from NYU Langone Medical Center: Tim McCord, a lecturer of science and writing; Nicole Rondo, a graduate student in virology; and Sam Davis, a graduate student in neuroscience. You folks probably might recognize Sam because she has a significant presence here in the ARO community. All of these folks have generously shared permissions to use slides here today. So, why a coffee hour on great and accessible presentations? There are a few reasons. First and foremost, the goal of a conference is to present and share scientific work. It is our committee's charge to communicate best practices for inclusion. And to take that a step further, presentations are integral to the scientific process, including providing the latest breaking information and providing opportunities for us to establish professional currency. And due to the unique and the artistic nature of presenting, is vulnerable to variation in quality and accessibility. We also want to disclose that this session by no means will be totally comprehensive. There are just too many dimensions to giving an effective presentation. And our goal here today is to distill a handful of these principles for communication accessibility. If you want to dive even more, some good resources include books by Edward Tupte, and this book on the bottom right, Trees, Maps, and Theorems. This one has great content specific to scientific communication. So here's our agenda for today. In the first three sections, we will cover some nuts and bolts for making presentations accessible. First, we'll cover maximizing signal to noise. Second, we'll cover playing to perceptual strengths. And third, we will cover practical strategies for inclusive design. And then we'll finish up with holistic approaches to accessibility and inclusion. And now starting with item number one, maximizing signal to noise. These first few sessions will be interactive, so I would like to ask the audience to be prepared to provide some answers. Just put those in the chat box and we'll have Sammy moderate that for us. Okay. So when talking to audiences, too often, a major issue is that there's just too much information to process. And I suspect that many of us have experienced the feeling depicted by the meme on the left. This slide is a little bit busy, but I'll take you through it. And this is unique for presentation because an audience has a limited capacity to absorb information, yet only has so much time before the next slide is presented. And violating this principle of limited capacity compounds and often is fatal for a presenter. So one of the principles to manage this limited capacity, we are going to borrow a concept championed by Edward Tupte, and that is to maximize data to ink ratio. We'll go through a few examples in a second, but the main consideration here is the amount of data being presented relative to the amount of ink that is printed on the slide or the poster. And to improve that ratio, we can minimize non-data ink coming from unnecessary visual distractors. Another way to improve this ratio is to minimize redundant data ink. So let's start with an example here. At first pass, this figure looks relatively simple. You probably don't need too much time to understand the figure and to extract the relevant data. However, when you consider more deeply the data to ink ratio in this figure, we might consider that the gray background is not necessary and can be removed. Second, the legends and the color schemes are redundant. They all indicate which animal, and those can probably be eliminated. And we also have some horizontal lines in the middle that could probably be removed. Some other low-hanging fruit, we can, of course, consider font size and appropriate line thicknesses to make this even clearer. So applying these changes, we get a figure that looks like this. Much better, right? In my own experience, these subtle changes reduces my visual strain. There's a smaller number of visual targets and a reduction in distractors. However, believe it or not, we could simplify this even further. And let me show you. In this edit, this figure contains all the same information, but arguably this figure is more effectively conveys the data and message due to an optimized data to ink ratio. We've removed the seemingly necessary line for axes, and we've gone ahead and plotted the actual body masses instead of asking the audience to extrapolate that from the y-axis. And yet we can still preserve comparisons of body mass across the three types of penguins. Okay, let's move on to another example here. One of the reasons why we might struggle with low data ink ratios is because default settings and plotting software might include a lot of short junk. For example, the figure here on the left is a sine and cosine function plotted by matplotlib, which is a Python software package. Now, again, this figure is clear enough, but there's a lot of room for improvement. So I'd like to ask the audience to chime in on what might be hindering this figure and how it might be improved. I'll just give you a few seconds and see if anybody answers.
Everybody's quiet today.
Not quiet. Maybe this is just a little warm-up axis here.
Looks like can label the axes as one piece of feedback. Yep, no labels.
Okay.
Some of the tick marks are not needed. Could use larger plot lines, different plot styles. It's a small font size.
Okay, right on. Yeah, totally. let's see.
There's a lot of other ones. Too many axes, missing a legend, adding a line at y equals 0.
Yeah, totally. All of the above. And my guess is that you've experienced this where you have a default plot in and all of, automatically you will run into these issues. Axis labels are too small, axis divisions perhaps are not natural for the data lines are too thin, consistent with everybody has written in the chat. And so this figure can be visually improved with all of these suggestions that people have provided. Better axes, better spacing between the tick marks, thickening lines. We've removed the box. And we've also used more appropriate and intuitive axis ticks, knowing that these are sine and cosine functions. Their zero crossings are going to be at 0, 2 pi, and so forth. Oh, great. So along the same lines, here are some example figures that are often designed to grab your attention, but they do contain significant chart junk. And so examples of chart junk includes over judicious use of colors, jazzy visual features, such as making what could be otherwise 2D figure images into 3D. And at the end of the day, the messages can often be delivered both aesthetically and simply. For example, shown on the right here, again, minimizing jazzy 3D effects, minimizing use of color and other details that don't really contribute significantly to the message. Another reason why we might struggle with low data sync ratios and presentations is that we might be tempted to copy and paste a figure directly from a paper manuscript. Oftentimes, we pour our energy into making a manuscript figure look amazing, providing exquisite detail, and that's good and all. If the reader has all the time in the world to read figure and then, zoom into the figure. But in a presentation and following the principle of limited capacity, perhaps a copy and paste of a manuscript figure is not the most appropriate step. Let's take a look at this example. The axis labels are kind of small. The inset is kind of small, and there's a lot of information, and perhaps the most important features are not emphasized. So on the right is an example of how a manuscript figure might be simplified to better convey a presenter's message more clearly and succinctly. First, the presenter has to determine that the clause in the insert is of significant importance. So this has been expanded for the audience to better see. Next, the axes are simplified, and while I might not be able to discern what's happening with the particles at x position equals 0.6, the author has to determine that was more distracting than helpful. And third, the number of lines plotted, the blue and the red lines, the number of these lines are reduced, which helps improve visual contrast. Okay, so let's use a more complicated example here for the last example of this section. I'd like to ask the audience again to chime in on what makes this figure challenging to read and what they might do to improve this figure. I'll give you a few seconds to type in and again ask Sammy to read out.
The yellow background is not helpful. Too many digits after the decimal. The labels are overlapping. Arbitrary colors. The legend is not helpful. Axis titles, too many lines in the plot. The grid lines are not helpful.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad that people are paying attention. We're hitting all the marks. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so the decimal points, there's too many significant digits. The SS labels overlap. Too many lines, yeah, they're kind of overlapping, so it's kind of hard to discern what one line is saying compared to the other. Definitely. Red lines are not very helpful. correct. We can remove that arbitrary colors, right? Hitting the mark. So now here is actually a suggested version of the same data set. It's much clearer. There's less visual noise. It's also clear which line is which, not having to use color, and putting redundant information as you have commented. And what's also interesting about this example is that it's possible to have too little ink with the original figure, which hinders or obscures the presentation of data. So again, this is a data to ink ratio. One way to improve that is to reduce the ink, but we need to also make sure that the data is also sufficiently displayed. Okay, so in this section, we've covered some principles and presented some examples on how to maximize signal to noise ratio figures. Let's take a quick moment and see if folks have any questions, comments, or remarks. Feel free to type in the chat and or turn on your mic. All right, I'll get up for them. All right. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with section 2 then, playing to perceptual strengths. So in this section, we're going to demonstrate how the selection of figure types may or may not align with perceptual strengths of the human visual system. And so here's an infographic that ranks the effectiveness on the y-axis, the top being most effective and the bottom being the least effective, how differences in the way quantitative data may be plotted, with the effectiveness being determined by mean errors of judgment. For example, humans are very good at determining the quantitative difference between the location of two dots along a horizontal axis, and we're decently good at differentiating lengths, again, plotted on the horizontal axis. We're also good at differentiating angles. However, as you see and move further down the chart, humans are less and less good at determining quantitative differences in volume, shading of luminance, and we are terrible at quantifying color saturations. So here's an example. If I asked you to bet $1 million, with the bet being whether the two cells with the stars are the same color or different color. $1 million is pretty enticing, but there's no way I would take the bet. I also don't have $1 million. But now on the bottom left star, for most people, looks darker than the top right star. And of course, knowing that this is an example intended to make the point that surround context biases the perception of color. And that's exactly the case. These are the same color. So let's do another example where I'll ask you to rate the differences in sizes of pies in a pie chart. Quickly, as fast as you can. Please type in the chat which pie segment is the third largest. And I'll have Sammy read out the answers.
C, F, B, D, C, F, B, and D. It's kind of a healthy mix. Another D.
Okay. All right.
Another C.
I think this perfectly illustrates how difficult this task is. So the answer is H. And so based on these answers, it's not immediately intuitive, right? Which one is the third largest? But let's try a different type of plot, a bar chart. Again, please type as quickly as you can. Which is the third tallest bar?
H, a lot of H's. H. Looks like the consensus is H.
All right, and that would be correct. Yeah, so folks here have a lot easier time determining the differences in the height of these bars. Perhaps you might have done a double take since there were 3 tall bars on the left, and each was plotted all the way on the right. But this demonstrates that the type of plot you use will allow you to better quantitatively discriminate the sizes of the the respective data. So I'm running out of time here, so I'll wrap up here by encouraging you to check out resources on perceptual strengths. There's a link here on this slide, which will be shared afterwards to all meeting attendees. That'll take you to the article shown on this slide here. And this article also references original sources, which are super interesting. And for some takeaways from sections 1 and 2 of this talk, first, minimizing uninformative markings can result in reduced cognitive burden. And second, choosing figure types to make visual discriminations easier can result in reduced perceptual burden. And so altogether, managing the principle of limited capacity will help the audience pay attention to the content of your talk. And so with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Julia Hike, who will take on sections 3 and 4. Thank you.
So starting from here, we're going to talk about some other practical strategies for inclusive design, and what we can do to make things more accessible to more people. So a lot of these are based on ways to make things more accessible for people with visual and reading disabilities. So just so that you're aware just how many people this affects, vision impairment affects 12 million Americans 40 years and older. Color vision deficiency affects somewhere between 2 to 8% of people assigned male at birth, and about 0.5% of people assigned female at birth worldwide. And dyslexia likely affects 1 in 5 people worldwide. So there's a lot of people who could really benefit because of their disability from changes to the way we present visual material. So these figures are from a study where they looked at a variety of papers in publications and to see how accessible they were to people with visual impairments. And what you can see is here we're looking for people at figures and color blindness. And you can see that the image features and also the labels are not visible in a fairly decent number of cases. So looking at the image features ranging from about 20 to 45% being not completely visible to colorblind, red-blind, colorblind individuals, and up to about 25% of the labels not being visible. I will tell you a little bit in the future about how we're going to try to avoid using color palettes that are difficult to see with color blindness. Another thing we can do is to make inclusive typography decisions. So to try to choose fonts that are more accessible. And the two main things that seem to matter are font size and also on the type of typography, some features of it that affect things like reading speed and visibility. So the font type. There's a whole range of psychophysical studies on what makes things a good font. But certainly for a digital presentation such as this one using slides, you want a 24-point font or higher. When you're trying to choose which font to use, I am well aware that people have quite strong opinions on this. Generally speaking, for any form of digital communication, it is always better to be using a sans serif font, meaning a font without all these little extra tiny lines at the tops and bottoms of the letters. And generally speaking, sans serif fonts are also easier to read for most disabled readers, even though some non-disabled readers do prefer them, the ones with serifs. So if you're trying to be the most accessible, you should be choosing a sans serif font. And in general, you should be choosing a humanist font. Now, there's a whole history behind why they're called humanist, but if you look up humanist fonts or humanist sans serif fonts, you can find some that are a good option for you. So for example, this whole presentation is being done with Aptos, which is the new default font, which I'm quite fond of. Another thing to consider is the contrast between, for example, text color and the surrounding background, or a figure feature and the surrounding background. There are particular formulas for the contrast metric, and I'm going to describe a tool to check this in a few slides. But there are some very specific web content accessibility guidelines, which generally state that a larger font can have a lower contrast ratio, something that's at least 3:1. And a smaller font needs a larger contrast ratio. So you can see here with the word science, the smaller one is much harder to read with the white on pink and much easier with the purple. And while it might be easier here for the purple and white, which has a larger contrast, this one's not quite as bad, right? However, both of these are still not adequate contrast. So trying to choose color palettes that are colorblind friendly is sometimes something that people get confused about or they're not sure how to go about. I got a question I'm going to address real quick. The font size for posters is not necessarily fixed. What you want is you want a poster font size that is easy to read from 3 feet out. Generally speaking, 24 is often too small for that, but it all kind of depends on what font you're using. There are some decent guides online for what is useful, but certainly not going below 24. And often recommendations are actually a little bit higher for like headings or that sort of thing. But there's less of an agreement because the font sizes vary so different greatly, and also how much distance people are expected to have from your poster or the print size of your poster. There's certain other factors to consider, so it's harder to give an exact rule of thumb. So moving back to color blindness, in the center of each of these circles is what a person with normal color vision would see. And what you can see on the outside of the circles is what someone with that form of color blindness might see instead. So you can use a graphic like this to help you choose which colors are more contrasting with one another. So given that information, let's do another polling of the audience. Which of these 2 images do you think is more colorblind friendly?
Looks like people are saying B.
And you would be correct. So if we were to use a color blindness simulation, you can see that it is much clearer to tell the difference between the dots in B than it was in A. Other things you can do to choose an appropriate color palette that is more accessible is you can use something like this color palette creator, which allows you to choose the colors you like, and it shows what those colors might look like with different forms of color blindness. I find this really helpful because if I want to, say, stick with colors that are in my institution's color template or something close to it, I can put those in here and I can see if they're going to be visible to my audience. Another option is to use Adobe Color. And that allows you to create a palette that is both colorblind friendly and has the appropriate contrast. It's a website where you can use palette creation, and you just go onto the Adobe Color website and check accessibility tools, and you're able to check both that it's colorblind safe and that the contrast is sufficient. There are also apps available to help you check whether or not your figures are accessible to a broader audience. One available for iOS is called Sim Daltonism, which we're going to show you a video from in a second. And the other one is that you could do is Color Oracle, which is available across multiple platforms. So this video is going to show a series of figures that were originally submitted for a paper that in a preprint, and they didn't originally use an accessible color scheme. But then the colors were changed when requested by reviewers. So we're going to show you what the old one looked like and then what the new one looked like. So there's the original figures. There they are with different forms of color blindness. Here's the new figures. And you can see here that that graph is much easier to read in the updated figure. And that it is visible in all options here. Another option is to check your colors using Adobe Illustrator, if that's what you use for your figures or your posters. And again, you're able to do a proof check in the view menu where you can look for color blindness checkers to double check that it's color blind accessible. So here is an example where you have the figure with someone for normal color vision all the way on the left, in the center, and on the right, you have simulations of what this would look like with different types of color blindness. You can see that whether the figure is still accessible or still visible with color blindness. There are some other strategies that can be helpful. For example, reinforcing or adding alternative symbols that can reduce reliance on color and prevent confusion. So in this instance, on the left, you have different, far left, you have the different countries represented by different colors, but also, or by color and symbol. And you can see that the colors themselves are not sufficient to differentiate between the countries, but when we have both color and symbol, it's possible to differentiate them. So one of the other things we can do is we can use multiple streams of information. So in microscopy, we often use a lot of red and green markers, which can make it difficult to make things visible for your viewer. So if we use red and green in the same image, this can cause issues for people with various forms of color blindness. Alternatively, we can have multiple individual channels that have high contrast that allow you to see things more clearly. And of course, in each instance, you would want to indicate any colors used in the legend so that it's clear what is being communicated. Another option is to provide grayscale versions of each channel, which can help you see the impact of the color and whether or not the image is viewable. Another thing we can do to make our communication more accessible is to provide alt text. So individuals with vision impairments or reading disabilities often utilize screen readers to describe visual information. And screen readers use text-to-speech or text-to-braille technology and provide a written description of any images. So what makes good alt text? There's a number of things to consider. One is to describe the image in context. Another is to provide any alt text for images after you present them. So for example, we have this lovely image. And I'm going to give you some good, better, and best, or bad, better, and best versions of the alt text we could supply. So one is a bad example where we have male athletes holding blue medals, which really doesn't get at what's really being in blue holding medals, which really doesn't get at what's being shown in this picture. A better example would be USA male Olympic gymnasts smile while holding up bronze medals. And finally, the best example would be Team USA's men's gymnastics team in blue tracksuits, smiling while holding bronze medals from the team competition, ending a 16-year medal drought. So that provides a lot of context that helps understand what's being shown in the picture. I do want to wrap up this section by noting, as one of you already did in the chat, that there are many automated tools on widely used apps. So starting here with Microsoft PowerPoint, if you go to the Review tab, you can find the Check Accessibility panel on the left. Note that there is also the option for always use subtitles, which I highly recommend everyone gets in the habit of doing, unless you know, like this webinar, that captioning or transcripts are already being made available. In general, this is good for everyone. I am a fast speaker, and what I have found is that the only thing in all my years of teaching that has ever gotten me to slow down even a little is to put the subtitles on. So everybody benefits from this. So that gets at some very specific strategies for inclusive design. But what about a holistic approach? So remember that accessible communication is clear, direct, and easy to understand. And in general, it should be made in multiple formats so all users have equal access. Other key components is that it has to consider various barriers, which we have covered in this talk, and either removing these or providing alternative formats. So let's talk a little bit more about what this means. Typically, when we're talking about accessibility, we're making accommodations, meaning we're transferring one sensory domain to another. So in the example of, for example, the alt text that we just talked about, we're taking an image and we're providing a written description that can be turned into auditory input or somatosensory input via Braille. Similarly, with using captioning or a transcript, we are changing an auditory stimulus into a visual stimulus, or same thing with American Sign Language. So there's an alternative, which is to try to leverage all sensory systems at the same time, relying on these sort of changes, right? These translations from one sensory modality to another is a little bit reactive, right? You do it if you know there's someone who's disabled, as opposed to assuming that there's always someone who's disabled. And we suggest maybe a more proactive and inclusive approach that is consistent with great communication. And that's to use all of the sensory streams at once. In other words, each parallel stream of communication, whether it's written, spoken, or visual, should stand mostly on its own. For example, we hope that the slides we produced by themselves would provide a complete communicated message. And we're going to be providing them after the fact so that people can read them over and have them without the time constraints of us flipping through them. In our experience, to effectively leverage all sensory streams requires skill, some that you hopefully learned today. And leveraging sensory streams also requires preparation and execution. And when this approach is done correctly, these inclusive presentations are already and automatically accessible. One example is that when showing auditory information, it's helpful to show a visual representation because sound is transient and passing. And so here we have an example from the Long Labs group meeting by Zedian, where he has a spectrogram to show the structure of birdsong along with the sound files. So this is a perfect example of parallel streams where we heard the sound file, if you were able to hear that, and you can also see a visual representation of that sound file. It reinforces a point that might have been missed by someone who missed part of the sound or has difficulty hearing. Some of you may benefit from this type of visual communication by watching videos with subtitles, which used to be something primarily disabled watchers do, and now many, many people are watching videos with subtitles simply because it helps. Another example to make presentations more inclusive is to recognize that presenting is more than just text, figures, and verbalized content. Communication includes many of the things that are depicted on this slide, such as gestures, facial expressions, and body language. For someone like me who is hard of hearing or someone who is deaf, having access to lip reading can be important and sometimes essential for accessing communicated content. I was joking the other day that I had just rewatched the movie V for Vendetta, and V wears a mask for the entire movie. And I would be completely unable to understand what's happening in this movie if I did not have captions on. The key in this case is to ensure visible access to lip reading, right? So one reason that that's one reason why we have preferential seating. That's often accommodation for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, so that they can see faces more clearly. To help someone with visual impairment, you might describe what you are wearing or what gestures you are making. For someone who's hard of hearing, you also might provide context about it, something being a joke, because things like captions don't necessarily take into account sarcasm or something being funny. The main thing here is to work towards recognizing all communication streams and to be cognizant about everyone's access to the communicated message. Here are a few more tips for ensuring access, depending on what kind of presentation. For example, for a slideshow presentation, such as this one, information's transient. Once a slide is gone, it's gone. So if possible, and definitely if requested, make sure that captioning is made available. And as mentioned on the previous slide, body language and lip reading are important. So one thing to consider is to ensure there's enough lighting and that everyone can see you. For poster presentations, instead of being paced by a speaker or slides, all the information is often presented all at once. One suggestion is to ensure visual flow is clear and that any figures are simplified to reduce noise. So those data to ink ideas and reducing that signal to noise or improving that signal to noise, like Ariel was telling you about, is even more important on a poster even than it is on a slideshow. Remember that poster printing can be suboptimal, so the suggestion here is to rely less on color and to use other means to convey information, such as symbols, grayscale, and individual images for individual channels of information, as Ariel mentioned earlier. And finally, at your posters, it's a great practice to ask your audience before you start if there's anything you can do to be more accessible. For example, they might ask you to wear a microphone they have with them, to stand in a particular location, or to let them read and then ask questions. Now for some final considerations. Clear and inclusive presentations take planning, preparation time, and intentionality. Great communication requires a holistic approach, and improving scientific presentations is a group effort and can be encouraged at all levels of science communication. That's one of the reasons that we're starting by judging the trainees poster blitz posters so that they're able to learn what inclusive presentations are and start early so that they can train the next generation. But if there's one message we'd like you to take away, that would be that not all inclusive communication is great, but all great communication is inclusive. And thank you so much for being here today. We're happy to take any of your questions.
Feel free to come in on the audio with your questions, or if you want to type in the chat.
Perhaps I have a question for the audience, if nobody has a question for us. I was wondering what people feel about, or how people feel about a black background with white text in a PowerPoint presentation. Is it helpful? Is it distracting? Or does it depend on the execution? Maybe Sammy and Julia can comment too. It doesn't have to be just the audience.
I have an opinion, but it's so nuanced that I'm not sure it's helpful. I think it depends somewhat on how it's being displayed. If you're using a projector, doing black background with white text doesn't tend to work that well. But if you're using a screen, it tends to work better.
Better than the projector or better than the white background?
Better than the projector.
Okay. All right.
I personally have everything switched to switch my black and white on my screens to do dark mode on everything because I get migraines. So to me, it's helpful if it's on a screen to have a black background with light text.
We have a comment from Elizabeth in the chat saying that she finds it nice, especially if there's a lot of histology images.
Because then you don't have to let your eyes adjust. Oh, I was going to tell you that someone asked me earlier about font sizes. The basic guidelines that I've put together and the ones we're telling the students is that we want generally 50-point or larger font for your title, 36 or larger for headings, and 24 or larger for author names and body text.
We have a question from George. For poster presenters, they upload a 1 to 3 minute audio file. Are there guidelines for that?
I think the biggest, yeah, go ahead, Sammy.
I was just going to say, as somebody with hearing loss, the audio files do not give you a visual look at somebody's face. So just trying to speak, slowly and clearly is easiest for me when I'm listening to those audio files.
And I will add that we would strongly encourage people who are uploading the 1 to 3 minute audio file to also add a audio transcript that is time-stamped and locked to each part of so that you're able to see what's being said. And we provided as a committee an example of what that would look like on the resources website.
Gonna go for a question like this now because it's so few people by now. If I want to check if something's okay for color blindness types, I mean, at some point I always get at this tryouts to if somebody sees no colors at all, and then I find it really hard to still decide to use colors because I actually like to have some colors and because it's visually pleasing. At what point is it okay to say, okay, the chances of somebody not being able to see any colors coming to my poster is so low anyway, or?
I think trying to choose a color palette, using some of those tools we talked to you about can be really helpful because I think if we're taking into kind of these concepts of inclusive design and that sort of thing, even if the likelihood of someone with zero color vision coming to your poster is low, everyone benefits from more contrast. So if you already are choosing some that we know work for various forms of color blindness, I would recommend checking even for, complete lack of color vision, that it works in black and white because, who knows when that will become relevant, or whether even just those small changes can help all watchers of the poster or the presentation.
Would you say at some point it's still even possible to have only via contrast discernible graphs? Because whenever I try to run a color, like one of those themes on really no colors, I wouldn't say I can see them if I don't change the plot style in between.
I would recommend changing the plot style.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Someone who doesn't have color vision doesn't need you to be using colors. They just need to be able to see what you're doing.
Thanks.
We just have a comment in the chat from our friend Jarnell. He said that wanted to remind us that providing an audio transcript is part of successful poster submission for ARO. So
Correct.
Yep.
Which is why we are providing you guys with a way of doing it that it isn't just a long string of speech. Because one of the things that we'll sometimes see when someone's doing those audio transcripts is it's just a paragraph. It doesn't have any pauses when we change a slide or things like that. And having those in there can really help people have essentially a virtual walkthrough of your poster, even if they're not able to listen to the audio and get much out of it.
Is this supposed to be the arrow poster audio transcript Word file on the website?
Yep.
Because if I currently click on the click here link, it does not open something, which may be my computer, but maybe
We will check that.
Thanks.
The committee poured a lot of man hours into trying to make sure all of these things existed. So we would very much like them to actually be there.
It's really great that you made the presentation and uploaded all the things. Makes it feel less unsure of what we are doing.
Thanks for that feedback. So this slide from today's presentation, we need to finish putting alt text on some of these figures, but they will be distributed directly to the email. Not sure if we'll put it on the website, but we'll explore that possibility as well. All right.
Any last lingering questions?
I think I just want to thank our audience for coming, for being interested in making their communication more accessible and for all people. And we look forward to seeing you all at the MidWinter meeting.
Thank you.